Imagine you are 20 years old. You haven't slept in 36 hours. You are sitting in a room so small, your knees nearly touch the metal wall in front of you. There are no windows. The only light in the room comes from the pale green glow of a radar screen, a soft, ghostly circle that sweeps around and around in the darkness. Outside, a tropical storm is raging. The ship beneath you rolls and groans. You can feel the ocean trying to swallow you whole. And then, on your screen, something appears. A contact, moving fast. Then another. Then 5. Then 12. Your heart stops. Because you have been trained for this exact moment. You have been trained to know that fast-moving contacts appearing out of nowhere in enemy waters mean only one thing. Torpedoes. You pick up the phone. Your hands are shaking, and you report what you see. That report, filed by a terrified young sailor on a stormy night in the Gulf of Tonkin, will reach the Pentagon within the hour. It will reach the White House within 2. And within 72 hours, Congress will use it to hand the President of the United States a blank check to wage war on Vietnam. 58,000 Americans will die in that war. 3 million Vietnamese will follow. And it may have all started because of weather, exhaustion, and a radar screen full of shadows. To understand what happened on the night of August 4th, 1964, you have to understand the world that made it possible. The Cold War was not a war fought with armies marching across borders. It was a war fought in shadows, in jungles, in back rooms, in the minds of frightened men convinced the world was one small mistake away from nuclear annihilation. Vietnam was one of those shadows. Since the French withdrew from Indochina in 1954, the country had been divided. A communist North under Ho Chi Minh, a fragile American-backed South. By 1964, the United States had already poured military advisors, money, and weapons into South Vietnam. But publicly, officially, America was not at war. President Lyndon Johnson needed a reason, a legal reason, a reason the American public would accept. What he did not yet have was the moment. The USS Maddox was a destroyer, a lean, fast warship, operating in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam in late July 1964. Her official mission was electronic intelligence gathering. She was listening, intercepting North Vietnamese radio communications, mapping their radar systems. But the North Vietnamese knew she was there. And on August 2nd, 2 days before the night that would change everything, they attacked her. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats made a run at the Maddox in broad daylight. The attack was real. The Maddox took 1 machine gun bullet. The torpedo boats were repelled. It was a minor engagement, but it set every nerve on that ship on edge. Every man aboard the Maddox went to sleep that night, knowing the enemy had already come for them once. The sonar room aboard a destroyer in 1964 was not glamorous. It was a metal box. It smelled of sweat and machine oil and stale coffee. The equipment was analog. Dials, switches, cathode ray tubes producing those famous sweeping green circles. And the men who operated that equipment were not seasoned veterans. Many of them were barely out of high school. That is not a criticism. It is a fact that matters enormously to what happened next. These were young men, 19, 20, 21 years old, who had been trained to operate sonar and radar systems in controlled conditions, in classrooms, in calm waters. What they had not been adequately trained for was this: interpreting radar returns in a violent tropical storm, at night, while running on no sleep, 2 days after a real enemy attack, with the knowledge that their government was watching their every transmission. The psychological pressure alone was enough to bend perception. By the evening of August 4th, the weather in the Gulf of Tonkin had turned savage. Winds were gusting to 34 knots. Seas were running 10 to 12 feet. The Maddox and her escort, the USS Turner Joy, were rolling hard, their hulls groaning against swells that came from every direction in the chaos of a tropical depression. Radar does not like weather like this. It never has. When waves are large enough, they return signals to a radar antenna in ways that look, on a screen, remarkably like solid objects. These are called false echoes, or radar ghosts. They appear and disappear. They move. They cluster. In a bad enough storm, a radar screen can look like it is surrounded by a swarm of fast-moving contacts. The young operators in that room didn't know yet which of the signals dancing on their screens were real. It began around 7:40 in the evening. A sonar operator, young, exhausted, already primed by the real attack 48 hours earlier, reported hearing something in the water, propeller sounds, high speed, the kind that belonged to torpedo boats. Then, the radar operators began reporting contacts, multiple contacts, fast-moving, closing in from multiple directions. In the fog of that moment, with rain hammering the hull and the ship pitching in darkness, the operators began connecting dots that may not have been there. A strange sound in the water became a torpedo. A radar ghost became an enemy boat. A cluster of false echoes became an ambush. Torpedoes were reported in the water, 22 of them, over the course of the night. The USS Turner Joy opened fire on radar contacts it could not visually confirm. Both ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard into the dark, churning sea. For nearly 3 hours, the two destroyers fought a battle against an enemy that no human eye ever saw. Captain John Herrick, commanding officer of the Maddox, was not a panicking man. He was experienced. And even in the middle of the chaos, even while his ships were maneuvering and firing, something bothered him. He would later describe a growing unease, a nagging doubt that gathered in the back of his mind as the night wore on. Where were the visual confirmations? Where were the wakes? Why had nobody actually seen an enemy vessel? At one point, a young sonar operator, overcome with the weight of what he believed he was reporting, turned to a superior and said words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I think I may have called in the torpedoes myself," he said. "I think I might have been hearing our own propellers." But the reports had already gone out. In the military chain of command, information flows upward fast and it flows downward slow. A report of an attack on U.S. naval vessels in international waters does not sit in an inbox. It moves at the speed of fear. Captain Herrick did send a message, a remarkable one given the circumstances. At 1:27 in the morning on August 5th, he cabled the Commander-in-Chief Pacific with words that should have stopped everything. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox suggest complete evaluation before any further action. He was telling his superiors, "Wait, something is wrong. We are not sure this happened." That cable sat in Washington at the same time that other cables, the ones reporting the attack, were already being processed at the highest levels of the United States government. In the machinery of power, the message that says, "slow down," almost always arrives after the machine has already started moving. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, received the initial attack reports and immediately briefed President Lyndon Johnson. It was still the early hours of August 5th, Washington time. Johnson was not a man who agonized over decisions. He was a man who made them and moved. McNamara would later testify that he did receive Herrick's cautionary cable. He was aware of the doubts. He mentioned them in his briefing of the president, and then he told Johnson that the attack had, in his assessment, definitely happened. There are historians who believe McNamara knew the evidence was thin and chose to present certainty anyway. There are others who believe he genuinely trusted the initial reports over the doubts. What is not disputed is this: a man with all the information in front of him chose to tell the most powerful person on earth that America had been attacked, when the truth was far less clear. At 11:36 p.m. on August 4th, President Lyndon Johnson appeared on national television and told the American people that unprovoked attacks on U.S. naval vessels in international waters demanded a response. 64 airstrikes were launched against North Vietnamese targets within hours: fuel depots, naval bases, torpedo boat facilities. And then, Congress moved. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed on August 7, 1964. In the Senate, the vote was 88-2. In the House, it was 416-0. The resolution authorized the president to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It was, in the words of one senator, like giving the president a blank check. Johnson himself reportedly called it like Grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. The United States was now, functionally, at war with Vietnam, not because of a military strategy, not because of a carefully reasoned policy debate, but because of reports filed in the dark by frightened young men on a ship in a storm. The doubts did not stay quiet for long. In the days following the incident, investigators combing through the signals intelligence, the intercepted North Vietnamese communications from that night, found something deeply troubling. The messages did not match the timeline of an attack. North Vietnamese naval commanders were discussing the August 2nd engagement, the real one, not a second attack on August 4th. There was no intercept that corroborated a second strike. The 22 torpedoes that operators reported, not a single one was ever physically confirmed. Not a wake, not a trail, not a fragment of wreckage recovered from the sea. Captain Herrick, in subsequent interviews over the following decades, never wavered from his assessment. He believed the second attack almost certainly did not happen. He believed the signals his men reported were the product of weather, mechanical noise, and the very human tendency, when you are exhausted and frightened, and the enemy has already come for you once, to see what you expect to see. James Stockdale was a Navy pilot flying combat air patrol above the two destroyers on the night of August 4th. He had a perfect aerial view of the water below. He would become one of America's most decorated prisoners of war in the years that followed, and he would spend the rest of his life saying the same thing about that night. I had the best seat in the house to watch that engagement. I didn't see any. Not a single boat wake, not a muzzle flash, not a searchlight. Nothing but black sea and American firepower. In 1995, Robert McNamara sat across from a former North Vietnamese general and asked the question that had consumed him for 30 years. Had North Vietnamese forces attacked the USS Maddox on the night of August 4th, 1964? The general looked at him and said, "No, it did not happen." McNamara, who by then had written a memoir cataloging his own failures and regrets, reportedly could not speak for a moment. The declassified NSA History of the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, released in 2005, confirmed what many had long suspected. The signals intelligence had been misread. Reports had been selectively interpreted. Doubts had been suppressed. The men at the top of the chain of command had received information that should have given them pause, and had chosen not to pause. But here is the thing about that conclusion that is both simple and devastating. None of those men in Washington that night were monsters. They were not cartoon villains spinning a war out of nothing for sport. They were men operating inside a system, a Cold War system built on the assumption that the communist threat was everywhere, that weakness invited aggression, that hesitation was itself a form of danger. They were men who believed, or chose to believe, that the attack was real, because the alternative, that an empire had stumbled toward war because of bad weather and a scared kid staring at a radar screen, was too enormous and too terrifying to accept. Nobody knows the name of the sonar operator. History did not preserve it. There is no monument to him. His name is not on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, though 58,000 names are. He almost certainly lived out his life in some American town, maybe with grandchildren and a yard in the driveway, carrying something with him that he may never have fully been able to explain. What do you do with that? What do you do when the moment that defined the rest of your life was a moment of confusion, a mistake made in darkness and exhaustion and fear by a 20-year-old boy who was doing exactly what his country had trained him to do? History is taught to us as a sequence of decisions made by powerful men, presidents, generals, senators, and in one sense, that is true. Lyndon Johnson signed the orders. McNamara presented the briefings. Congress cast the votes. The machine of American power turned, and it turned deliberately. But underneath those decisions, beneath the cabinet meetings and the televised addresses and the congressional resolutions, there was a ship in a storm. There was a radar screen full of ghosts. There was a young man, tired beyond reason, scared beyond reason, who looked at the dancing green light and saw what he had been trained to fear. He picked up a phone. He reported what he saw. He did his job. And that is, perhaps, the most tragic thing about the Gulf of Tonkin. Not that powerful men lied, though some did. Not that a government manipulated its people, though it did. But that at the very foundation of it all, beneath every layer of politics and ideology and Cold War calculation, the entire catastrophe may have rested on something as fragile and as human as a young man's exhausted eyes misreading shadows in the dark. History does not always turn on the decisions of the powerful. Sometimes it turns on the perceptions of the powerless, on the blur between what is real and what is feared, on the difference between a wave and a weapon, between signal and noise, between a shadow on a screen and a cause for war. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. 3 million Vietnamese followed. An entire generation was consumed. And on a radar screen, somewhere in the Gulf of Tonkin, a ghost signal swept around and around in the dark, and nobody in the room could be certain whether it was real.